In the middle of a fog-laced field, a small dog stepped forward, lifting her head to face the hovering drone in the sky. No fear, no submission. In those silver eyes lived the remnants of a soul once forged into a weapon. Now she chooses humanity, either to forgive or to destroy. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking emotional episodes, just like this one. The blizzard came fast. One moment the mountain road had been quiet under a curtain of snow. The next it was chaos, headlights, spinning tires, skidding metal, grinding against metal. Grace gripped the steering wheel of her Subaru like a lifeline, her knuckles pale, her breaths shallow and rapid. In the back seat, 6-year-old Eli was silent for once, too stunned even to cry. They hadn't seen the ice until it was too late. A semi had jackknifed ahead, its trailer turned sideways across the road, a hulking beast of steel and rubber blocking everything. Grace had tried to swerve her tires, screaming across the glassy asphalt, but it was no use. The car clipped the side of the trailer and spun into a snowbank, the impact jarring, but by some miracle not fatal. Now everything was still, white, quiet, terrifying. Grace blinked, trying to orient herself. The airbag had gone off. The cabin smelled of burnt chemicals and cold metal. And Eli was curled in the back seat, his eyes wide, clutching the stuffed tiger he took everywhere. His lip was trembling. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice hoarse, ragged. He nodded slowly, but didn't speak. She exhaled a shaky breath and reached for the door. It opened with a reluctant groan, snow immediately swirling into the car. The wind bit at her cheeks, slicing through her coat like tiny knives. She stepped into the storm. The scene outside looked like the aftermath of a small war. Vehicles were scattered across the mountain road, some in ditches, some still smoldering. The semi's cab had flipped onto its side, and its trailer now resembled a crushed soda can. Emergency sirens weren't coming. Not up here. Not in weather like this. Grace turned back toward the car. "Stay inside," she told Eli. "I'm just checking for injured people." He didn't answer, just stared at her through the window. She trudged forward, boots sinking ankle-deep in snow with every step. The wind howled like it had lost its mind. Everything was white, fractured, surreal. She passed the twisted skeleton of a pickup truck, its engine still ticking with heat. No one inside. Then just barely she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A low, broken whimper. Grace froze. She scanned the snowy wreckage. The sound came again, like someone or something in pain. She followed it instinctively, weaving between vehicles, past a burned-out van and a shattered guardrail. And then she saw it. The semi-truck. Its cab had been crushed under its own trailer. The metal groaned, occasionally creaking under the weight of its own collapse. But beneath the wreckage, just barely visible through a jagged hole in the truck's undercarriage, lay something alive. At first she thought it was a child. Then it moved. Not a person. A dog. A large one. The Malinois lay half buried in the snow, twisted under a piece of mangled steel. Her coat, what remained of it, was soaked with blood and ice. Her eyes were closed. Her chest barely moved. Grace's first instinct was to walk away. She was a nurse. She'd seen what trauma did to animals, how pain could turn even the gentlest creature into a weapon. This dog looked broken, near death, possibly rabid, and she had Eli to think about. But then the creature exhaled, a single shuddering breath, and opened its eyes. Pale blue, not the soft brown of most shepherds. Not yellow, not green. Blue, piercing, unnatural. Like a glacier cracking open in the sun. Grace took a step back without realizing it. Her heart pounded. The dog blinked slowly, then fixed its gaze on her. It didn't snarl, it didn't growl, it didn't make a sound. But the look, it wasn't the look of an animal fighting to survive. It was something else. Intelligent, calculated, sad. "Mom," the voice cut through the wind like a shot. Grace turned. Eli was outside the car, trudging toward her through the snow. His tiny form wrapped in a puffy green coat, his stuffed tiger dragging behind him like a ghost. "Eli, I told you to stay in the car." But he didn't stop. He reached her side, his cheeks flushed red, snow in his eyelashes. And then he saw the dog. He froze. For a moment, Grace thought he might scream. But instead he whispered, "She's not ready to die yet." Grace turned to him, startled. "What?" Eli crouched down in the snow just feet away from the mangled wreckage, peering into the shadows where the dog lay. "She's asking for help," he said. "I can hear it." His voice wasn't panicked. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm. "Certain. She's saying please," Eli continued. "Please don't leave me." Grace stared at her son, the hair on the back of her neck rising. She looked back at the dog. It hadn't moved, but the eyes, they were locked on Eli now. And for a second, just a second, something passed between them, like a silent agreement. Grace shook her head. "We can't help her. She's hurt too badly, and it's dangerous." You don't know what she is. She's someone, Eli said, still looking into those eyes. Not something. Someone. The snow whipped harder now, coating the road, blanketing the world. Grace took a breath. Then another. She looked around. There was no help coming. No sirens. No medics. They were alone. And this dog, this creature should not have survived. But she had. Barely. And somehow, impossibly, Eli had hurt her. She didn't know if she believed him. But she believed in him. Grace cursed softly and knelt down beside her son. Okay, she said. Okay, we'll try. Carefully, she moved closer to the wreckage. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. Grace grabbed a length of twisted metal and used it as a lever, slowly pushing aside the chunk of debris trapping the animal's hindquarters. The dog whimpered just once, but didn't try to bite. When the wreckage shifted, Grace saw the extent of the damage. The dog's rear leg was badly lacerated, possibly fractured. Blood matted her fur, but the bleeding had slowed, frozen by the cold. Eli Grace said, "Get a blanket from the car." He ran without hesitation. The dog's eyes followed him the whole way. When he returned, Grace wrapped the blanket around the animal, tucking it under her torso. She hesitated only a moment before sliding her arms beneath the dog's shoulders. "She's heavy," Grace muttered through gritted teeth. "Help me lift." Together, mother and son heaved. The dog groaned, but didn't resist. Step by step, they carried her through the snow. Eli holding the back end as best he could, Grace supporting most of the weight. It took 10 minutes to reach the cabin. By the time they got inside, Grace was soaked with sweat, her muscles trembling. They laid the dog on a rug near the fireplace. She didn't move, didn't bark, didn't close her eyes either. Just watched them. Eli knelt beside her and placed one small hand on her paw. "I'm going to take care of you now," he whispered. Grace stood in the corner, wiping her face, watching them. Something about the moment unsettled her, not because of fear, because of familiarity. She had seen this scene before, not with a dog, with patients, trauma survivors, war victims. The way they looked at the person who pulled them back from the edge. That same quiet intensity, that same, "Thank you." Grace didn't know what they had just brought into their home, but she knew one thing. This dog wasn't ordinary, and she wasn't alone anymore. Neither was her son. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows. Inside, 3 lives sat together in a circle of fading warmth. And deep in the heart of the Malinois, something ancient stirred. Not instinct, not training. Something else. Recognition. The dog hadn't moved in hours. Grace checked her pulse more than once, convinced she was fading. But every time the steady thump beneath the damp fur told her otherwise. Alive. Quiet. Watching. She lay stretched out on the rug like a statue wrapped in Eli's old fire truck blanket. Barely breathing, her blue eyes fixed on the fireplace, like she was memorizing the flames. But every few minutes, without fail, she turned those eyes toward Eli. And every time she did, the boy smiled. He hadn't left her side since they carried her in. He'd barely eaten, barely spoken to Grace. And now he was whispering, not to her, to the dog. "Her name is Maven," he said softly, stroking the top of her head. "She told me." Grace, who was in the kitchen boiling water, froze. "She told you," she repeated. Eli nodded without looking up. "In my head." Grace stepped into the living room, towel in one hand. "Eli, what do you mean she told you?" "I don't know." He scratched behind the dog's ears, gentle and slow. "It's like when I read stories out loud, and you say I don't have to say the words out loud to feel them. It's like that. Like, she just put it in my brain." Maven. The name felt strange in her mouth. It wasn't something she would have picked. Too deliberate. But when she said it, the dog lifted her head. Her ears twitched. Her eyes met Grace's. Like she knew, like she approved. Grace narrowed her eyes. "Okay," she murmured. "Sure." She knelt beside her son. Maven didn't flinch. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The deep wound along her side had started to clot, and her leg, while swollen, seemed to be less tender. But she still hadn't made a single sound. Not a whimper, not a bark, not even a sigh. Grace placed a warm cloth along her flank, trying not to tremble as she pressed gently. The dog's eyes followed her every move. "She's not like other dogs," Eli said suddenly. "No," Grace muttered. "She's not. She doesn't just feel pain. She understands it." Grace paused. Eli's face was serious. Too serious for a 6-year-old. "She knows what she lost," he added. "It's why she didn't want to be left behind." The cloth slipped from Grace's fingers. She looked at her son. "How do you know that?" Eli finally turned his gaze away from Maven and looked at her. "She told me." There was no drama in his tone, no exaggeration, just fact. And those blue eyes of Maven's were still watching, still listening. That night, the lights flickered for the first time. They were sitting at the small table near the window, eating reheated soup and crackers. Grace had just lit a second candle when the kitchen overhead began to buzz a low electric hum that vibrated the glass in the cabinets. Then came the flicker. Once, twice, a full second of darkness. Grace's hand paused, mid-air spoon dripping broth. The generator hadn't kicked in. Power was still on. She glanced at the thermostat, no change, no surge. Then Maven walked into the room, and everything blinked again. Eli perked up. "See," he said, pointing. "She does that." Grace gave him a side glance. What? The lights and the phones. Sure enough, the moment Maven patted past Grace's phone on the counter, the screen lit up. No calls, no notifications. Just the time, 1:11 a.m. repeating itself like a broken record. Then it blinked out again. Radio static erupted from the battery-powered unit in the corner. A garbled voice sputtered through for half a second, then silence. Maven stopped in the middle of the kitchen and stared at Eli. He giggled. "She likes playing." Grace didn't. She stood up slowly. "Maven," she said. "Sit." The dog didn't move. Not out of defiance, no. It was like the command didn't register. But then, without breaking eye contact with Eli, she lowered herself to the floor and laid down. Grace's skin crawled. "Sweetheart," she said carefully, "I think something's not right with her." "She's not broken," Eli said simply. "She's awake." Grace knelt beside the dog again. Maven's breathing was calm now, measured. Her fur slightly cleaner where Eli had wiped her down earlier. The deep scars along her belly were old, but surgical. Too precise for a fight or accident. She looked less like a stray and more like a veteran. "You think she's been through something?" Grace asked aloud. "She remembers everything," Eli whispered. Later that night, after tucking Eli into the makeshift cot beside Maven, Grace poured herself a cup of decaf and sat in the kitchen just watching them. The fire cast long shadows on the wooden walls, flickering across Eli's peaceful face. He had one hand resting on Maven's back, and Maven was staring at the window, unmoving, guarded, like she'd seen things no living creature should have seen. At 2:37 a.m., Grace awoke to a faint buzzing. She reached instinctively for her phone, dead. The power was still on, but the phone had gone black. Not just black hot. She touched the screen and winced. Overheating while off. She got out of bed, pulled on her robe, and crept to the living room. Eli was still asleep. Maven wasn't. The dog sat upright now, ears alert, eyes glowing faintly in the fireplace light. Her head cocked slightly toward the window. Grace moved silently toward the curtain. When she peeked through the glass, nothing was there. No wind, no figures, just the dark stretch of trees swaying beneath the full moon. Still, Maven didn't relax. She rose slowly, paced to the door, and sat, waiting, watching. She didn't growl, didn't whine. She just listened. Grace whispered, "What do you know that I don't?" No answer. Just those pale eyes reflecting fire and frost. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was hushed, wrapped in a heavy white stillness. Grace made pancakes, coaxed Eli into eating a few bites, and tried to pretend the previous night hadn't happened. But the moment Maven entered the room, the kitchen light fizzed again. Not a coincidence. Grace stared hard at the dog. "Can you hear me?" she asked aloud. Maven stared back, not with confusion, not with fear, but with something almost worse. Patience. Eli set his fork down and leaned across the table. "She doesn't answer with words," he said. "She answers with feelings." "What kind of feelings?" "Like warmth, sadness, pictures sometimes, sounds. Like when you remember a song but not the lyrics." Grace rubbed her temples. "She's communicating with you in memories, maybe." Eli shrugged. "Or maybe I'm just special." He grinned. She couldn't help but smile back, but it faded quickly. "You're not scared of her." Eli shook his head. "She understands me. She's a dog. She's Maven." That was the end of that. By noon, Grace had started documenting everything. Power surges, radio bursts, Maven's responses to different commands, her lack of vocalization, her intense tracking behavior, the way she always sat between Eli and the door. She pulled up Google on her laptop and searched for experimental canines, neurological enhancements, anything close to what they were seeing. The results were either vague fictional or terrifying. Meanwhile, Eli taught Maven tricks. Not sit, stay, or fetch, but things like find my socks, which Maven did in under 3 minutes, despite never having seen them before. Turn off the lamp, which she managed by nosing the wall switch deliberately. "Listen to my heart," Eli said once, lying on the floor with his chest exposed. And Maven did. She placed one paw gently over his heart and just stayed there for almost 10 minutes, like she was learning its rhythm. When Grace finally asked, "Why do you think she listens to you?" Eli simply said, "Because I don't tell her what to do. I ask." That night, just before bed, Eli sat beside Maven and whispered, "She's not here because she's lost Mom. She's here because she was supposed to find me." Grace didn't know what scared her more, the dog, or how much she was starting to believe her son. The snow had stopped falling 2 days ago, but the world outside the cabin still wore a blanket of white. Everything muffled, frozen, still. Inside, Grace was restless. Something gnawed at her. Not just the strangeness of the dog, or the flickering lights, or even Eli's insistence that he could hear Maven. No. It was deeper than that, like a splinter she couldn't locate but couldn't stop feeling. She sat at the kitchen table late that afternoon, Maven lying on the floor nearby, half asleep. Eli was building something with his Legos on the rug, humming to himself. Grace's eyes drifted to Maven again. It wasn't just the eyes, though. Those were unsettling enough. Icy deliberate, like they belonged to something calculating, rather than reactive. It was her stillness. The way she didn't pant, didn't twitch, didn't blink unless she meant to. Every movement felt intentional. Then, as Maven shifted her head in sleep, Grace saw it. A patch of fur behind the dog's right ear, slightly thinner than the rest. And beneath it, a faint scar. No, not just a scar. A straight line, precise, surgical. She stood crossing the room slowly, careful not to startle her. Maven, she whispered. The dog didn't stir. Grace knelt, brushing back the fur behind the ear heart, pounding in her chest. There it was. A faint but visible incision, healed, but not old. Barely the length of her pinky nail. The kind of scar you only noticed if you were looking for it. She didn't want to touch it. But her fingers moved anyway. When she pressed gently along the edge, something hard shifted beneath the skin. A foreign body. Something implanted. Maven didn't flinch. She opened her eyes, but remained still. Grace felt sweat rise along her spine. Eli, she called without looking up. Can you bring me the first aid kit? He obeyed instantly. Within moments, she had her gloves on and the small sterilized kit unzipped beside her. Her fingers trembled as she retrieved the tweezers. I'm sorry, girl, she whispered, brushing her hand over Maven's head. If this hurts, I'll stop. Maven blinked once, as if in acknowledgement. Grace bit her lip, steadied her hand, and made a small, careful incision along the old scar. Blood beaded, but not much. She pushed gently into the tissue and hooked the tweezers around a small metallic object. It came out slick with the blood and tissue. A microchip, not the kind they used for pet IDs. This was different. Thicker. Black. Marked with a faint triangular emblem she didn't recognize. Grace placed it on a gauze pad and stared. Eli crawled closer, fascinated. What is it? I don't know yet. She retrieved a USB converter from the drawer, one she used for her old external drives. Carefully, she cleaned the chip and inserted it into the adapter. Then she slid it into her laptop. The screen flickered. Static. A loading bar appeared, but no text. Then, as if summoned by something beneath the surface, a folder opened. Encrypted files. Names she didn't recognize. Strings of alphanumeric gibberish, except one. A title stark and chilling in its simplicity. Athena terminated project. Do not reactivate. Grace's stomach dropped. What's Athena? Eli asked. I don't know, she whispered. But she had a feeling. She clicked the folder. Password protected. She tried a few random guesses, Maven project even 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but nothing worked. She stared at the prompt, her fingers hovering. Suddenly the lights in the cabin dimmed. The laptop screen blinked. Then a warning appeared in bold red letters. Security breach detected. Trace protocol initiated. Grace yanked the USB drive out so fast she nearly tore it. The laptop went black. Mom, Eli said softly. She didn't answer. Her heart was hammering, her hands shaking. She looked at Maven. The dog was awake now, sitting upright, staring directly at the laptop, like she understood, like she'd been waiting. That night, Eli fell asleep early. His small body curled around Maven like she was just another stuffed animal. Grace couldn't stop pacing. She checked every door, every lock, every window. Nothing out of place, but it felt like the house was breathing differently now. She tried the radio static. She tried her phone dead again. The backup battery pack drained. Her analog watch had even stopped ticking sometime during dinner. Everything electronic near Maven seemed to decay or die, but it wasn't just the equipment. It was Eli. At 3:17 a.m., he sat up in bed and began speaking. Grace was jolted awake from the couch, half delirious from a restless doze. She rushed to the bedroom thinking he was having a nightmare. But when she reached him, her blood turned to ice. He wasn't speaking English. Not gibberish, not sleep mumbling. Language, a real one. It sounded Eastern European, sharp consonants, rhythmic patterns. Something she'd only heard in documentaries about Cold War defectors and Black Ops missions. Maybe Slavic, maybe Russian. But Eli had never learned it, never heard it as far as she knew. He kept talking. His eyes were shut. Maven lay beside him, not asleep, listening. Her head was raised, her ears alert. But she didn't move. Grace stepped forward, reached out. Eli stopped. He opened his eyes and looked straight at her. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. There was a clarity there, an absence of childhood, like something ancient had borrowed his skin. Then he blinked. Mom, he whispered. She fell to her knees and hugged him tightly. By morning, the unease had turned to paranoia. Grace couldn't shake the image of that file terminated project. Do not reactivate. She couldn't unhear her son's voice speaking a language he'd never learned. and she couldn't ignore the way Maven had started shadowing them, always a step behind, always facing the windows, the doors, the trees, watching, waiting. That afternoon, Grace took her binoculars and stepped outside, needing air, needing answers. From the back deck, the view stretched out across the snowy pines. Beautiful, deceptive. She swept the tree line slowly, methodically, and then she saw it, a shape, high above, small but unmistakable. A drone, black silent, gliding like a predator just below the cloud line. It hovered for a second, then zipped out of sight. Grace ran inside. "Illy, get your coat." "Why?" "We're leaving." "Where?" "I don't know. Somewhere off-grid." Maven was already at the door, like she'd known they would run. But Grace froze before grabbing the keys, because the drone hadn't just appeared. It had found them, meaning something or someone had been looking. Not for her, not for Eli, but for Maven. The dog wasn't a stray. She was a fugitive, and someone wanted her back. It began with a dream. Eli stood in the hallway at the edge of sleep, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor, his breath visible in the air inside the house. The fire had gone out. The power was dead again. The wind outside moaned like it was mourning something ancient, and yet he walked forward. Guided, the hallway stretched longer than he remembered. Shadows lengthened across the walls in unnatural patterns. The floor creaked beneath each careful step. He could feel Maven nearby, not beside him, but somewhere behind, watching, pushing him forward. He stopped at a door. It hadn't been there before. Or had it? The paint was different, older, cracked. There was no doorknob, just a keyhole filled with ice. He pressed his hand to it. The wood pulsed. A sound faint mechanical clicked behind the wall. Then Eli opened his eyes. He was back in bed, but the door still existed. He could feel it. Grace found him the next morning staring at the floorboards near the back hallway. "What are you doing?" she asked, still groggy, her hair wild from sleep. "There's a door," he said, under the rug. Grace rubbed her eyes. "What?" "Here." He pulled back the frayed runner rug, revealing the outline of a trap door. There was a seam in the wood, subtle but visible. Grace knelt beside him. Her pulse quickened. She didn't remember any mention of a basement when they rented the cabin. She hadn't seen it in the blueprints online. No stairs, no latch, no reason to even suspect one. And yet here it was. Eli looked up at her, eyes steady. "I think we have to go down." She hesitated, then nodded. They pried open the hatch with a screwdriver and a crowbar. The hinges groaned as if they hadn't been touched in decades. Dust exploded into the air, thick and choking. A narrow stairwell disappeared into blackness. Grace turned on her flashlight. It flickered twice, then stabilized. Eli didn't wait. He stepped onto the first stair. "Careful," Grace warned, clutching his shoulder. He nodded. She said it's okay. Grace didn't ask who she was. She already knew. The basement was colder than outside. Not the natural cold of winter, but something deeper, man-made. Engineered. The walls were reinforced concrete. The air smelled like rust and bleach. There were no spiderwebs, no dust, just silence, like the place had been waiting for them. At the bottom of the stairs, a single bulb hung from a cord in the ceiling, long dead. The flashlight beam swept the room. Grace stopped breathing. A metal workstation stood against one wall. Wires spilled from a broken control panel like intestines. Dials, switches. A monitor cracked down the center. To the left, a map of the western states peppered with red thumbtacks. To the right, photographs, grainy black and white pinned to a corkboard. Each one featured dogs. Maven was in 3 of them. In the first, she was younger, smaller, wearing some kind of harness, standing beside 2 men in lab coats. In the second, she was mid-leap, eyes glowing faintly, mouth open, in what looked like a training simulation. In the third, she was lying on a table, her belly swollen, surgical tools beside her. Eli pointed to that one. "That's the one I saw in my head." Grace turned to him, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" "I dreamed it," he said. But it wasn't a dream. It was hers. The flashlight flickered again. Grace banged it against her palm. The beam landed on a dusty metal cabinet in the corner. She opened it. Inside were folders, old, yellowed, marked with government insignia she didn't recognize. One read, "Project Athena, Field Phase 4, Reproductive Viability Study." She opened it. Inside were notes handwritten and typed spanning over a decade. Diagrams, genetic sequencing data, behavioral assessments. Phrases leapt from the page. Cross-species neurological resonance. Subject number 7 displayed increased synaptic activity in response to early-stage human vocalization. Implanted cortical receivers continue to function despite power source separation. Subject may retain memory imprinting beyond gestation cycle. Grace's vision blurred. She felt like she was reading a horror script someone forgot to make into a movie. Eli walked further into the room, drawn by something invisible. He stopped in front of another photo on the far wall. It was older, almost faded beyond recognition. But the subject was unmistakable. Maven. Still young, but not alone. A silhouette beside her, not a person. Something glowing inside her stomach. An X-ray image. 4 tiny shapes inside her womb. One of them lit up. "Is that a baby?" Eli asked. Grace didn't answer. Her knees gave out. She sat on the cold floor, documents falling around her like snow. "We're in the middle of something, aren't we?" she whispered. "Something we're not supposed to see." Eli crouched beside her, placing a hand on her back. "She's not just a dog, Mom." "No," Grace said. "She's the message." From who she didn't know, but the evidence was everywhere. This place had been a lab. A secret one. Hidden under a rental property in the mountains. Used for experimentation far beyond any moral compass. Shut down maybe, but not forgotten. The most terrifying part wasn't the science. It was the intent. These people weren't just trying to create obedient animals. They were trying to build something more. Something hybrid. Eli stood suddenly. "She's coming." Grace's head jerked up. Footsteps echoed above them. Soft, deliberate. Then Maven appeared at the top of the stairs. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She didn't move. She just stood there, blocking the way back up. Eli walked to the bottom step and looked up at her. "She doesn't want us to go deeper," he said. Grace stared at them both, her pulse spiking. "Why?" She said not yet. They slept uneasily that night. Maven lay in front of the trapdoor, curled like a sentinel, her body coiled and alert. She never closed her eyes. Never twitched. Grace couldn't shake the weight of what she'd seen. The files. The experiments. The unborn creatures in Maven's belly. She sat at the table in the dark, the last candle flickering beside her. She whispered, "What are you?" The silence didn't answer. But in the other room, Maven lifted her head slightly, as if she'd heard, as if she'd understood, as if the question was still echoing through her bones, waiting to be answered when the time was right. And Grace knew. They were no longer hiding Maven. They were standing at the center of a story that had been unfolding long before they arrived. And the locked room was only the beginning. Grace had never felt more unsure of what she was doing. She wasn't a veterinarian, but she'd worked ER long enough to recognize trauma-vital symptoms. And whatever was happening inside Maven, it wasn't natural. She tightened the stethoscope against the dog's belly, listening. A faint rhythm pulsed beneath Maven's skin, and not just a heartbeat, multiple. Rapid, unsettlingly synchronized. She shifted the scope. Another rhythm. Faster. Too fast. Eli watched from across the room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a sketchbook in his lap. He wasn't drawing pictures like he used to. Not anymore. Now he sketched circles, grids, unintelligible symbols that looked pulled from blueprints, not a child's imagination. "She's growing them quickly," he said without looking up. Grace turned to him, stethoscope still in hand. "What do you mean?" He tapped his pencil once. "The puppies. They're not like other puppies. They're thinking already." Grace stared at him. "Eli, you can't possibly know. They talk to me." Silence. Dead silence. Grace lowered the stethoscope slowly. "What?" "Not with words. With feeling. They're dreaming, even though they're not born yet. I can feel it." He met her eyes, absolutely certain. Grace's hands went cold. She confirmed the pregnancy the only way she could. An old portable ultrasound unit stored in a battered case in the basement medical stash she'd overlooked earlier. Surprisingly, it still worked. Power surged through it after a few false starts, and she prepped the gel with trembling hands. Maven didn't resist. She lay on her side, body calm, tail still, as if she understood. Grace applied the probe. At first static, then shape, then life. 4 distinct forms, large, active, pulsing with motion far too coordinated for where they should have been developmentally. She checked the dates, did the math. They were growing 10 times faster than normal. 10 times. And their brain waves, she could swear the signal was interfering with the scanner itself. The display jumped, flared, twitched every time she moved near their skulls. "This isn't gestation," she whispered. "This is evolution." She looked at Maven, whose eyes were open now, calmly watching her. "You knew." No answer. Just the soft, slow breath of something ancient, waiting to arrive. That evening, Eli sat beside Maven. Both of them facing the fireplace. The flames had dimmed, casting shadows like silent dancers across the walls. He was humming, a tune Grace didn't recognize. Then he stopped, tilted his head. "They're excited," he said. "They know it's soon." "Soon?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "How soon?" "I don't know, but they're ready." He turned and looked straight at her. "They're not scared of being born. They're scared of what's outside." Outside. The word hit like a rock. Grace hadn't seen the drone again, but she'd felt its absence, like the eye of a storm circling back. She needed answers, not instincts, not dreams. Data. She opened a fresh page in her notebook and began documenting every observation. Date, time, Maven's behavior. Flickering lights when she walked into a room. Microwave resetting itself to Osher whenever Maven passed it. The car battery inexplicably drained, twice. The way Eli's cognition seemed to heighten around her finishing sentences before Grace spoke, knowing when her phone would ring before it did. 1 page became 2, then 3. She circled a cluster of notes and wrote 3 words across the top. Neural link. Resonant empathy. left brain frequency of child cognition. She stared at it for a long moment. Maven wasn't just connected to Eli emotionally. She was tuned to him, harmonized, like music written in biological code. The event with the wolf happened on the third night of snowfall. They were walking in the woods, near dusk. Grace, Eli, Maven. It was a small clearing they'd visited before quiet and bordered by tall pines. Grace had brought her father's old rifle more for the illusion of protection than anything else. Maven stopped halfway across the field, tail stiff, ears lifted. Grace followed her gaze. At the edge of the trees stood a wolf, mangy, wild-eyed ribs showing through its fur. It had the gaunt hunger of an animal starved too long in the cold. It growled. Maven didn't move. The wolf stepped forward. Eli gasped. Maven stepped in front of him, her body low, but still. No sound. No growl. Just presence. The wolf hesitated. They stared at each other. And then slowly, impossibly, the wolf whimpered. It turned and ran. No fight. No challenge. Just surrender. Eli whispered. She spoke to it. Grace didn't ask what he meant. She believed him. That night, Grace returned to her journal, her hands almost trembling with the weight of what she'd seen. She wrote one word in all caps. Deference. Whatever Maven was becoming or already was, other creatures knew. She flipped to a new page and drew a neural map, 2 hemispheres connected by spirals. One labeled Maven, the other Eli. She shaded the overlapping middle. This wasn't human-to-animal bonding. This was communion. Something new. Something dangerous. She turned back to her files from the basement. Project Athena had always sounded grandiose, mythical. But the more she read, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. They had been trying to create consciousness, not mimic it, not force obedience, emerge it, engineered sentience, gestational resonance, cross-species link. And it had worked. Maven wasn't their mistake. She was their success, which meant, if Grace was right, they hadn't abandoned the project out of failure. They had shut it down out of fear, or worse, because they had plans for what came next, plans that required Maven to survive and deliver. And if Eli was already linked, Grace dropped her pen, looked toward the room where her son slept, where Maven lay curled around him like a sentinel goddess carved from obsidian. She whispered, "What are you doing to him?" And in the quiet, just for a moment, she swore Maven's ears lifted. It happened at 2:41 a.m., the kind of hour where silence deepens and time slows into something dangerous. Grace sat half asleep at the kitchen table, a cup of stale tea clutched between her hands, her eyes heavy, but her nerves too raw to rest. Then a sound, no louder than a breath, broke the quiet. The smallest creak, floorboard near the back entrance. She stiffened. Not Maven, she'd been asleep in Eli's room. Not Eli, he never moved without calling for her. Grace stood slowly, slipping off her slippers, bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She crossed the room with practiced caution, her hands trembling but her instincts kicking in like a reflex from her trauma, shifts back in the ER. Another sound closer this time. Movement, deliberate. She grabbed the fire poker from beside the hearth and crept toward the hallway. 1 breath. 2. The shadow rounded the corner. A man broad-shouldered, dressed in dark tactical gear. Not police, not a thief. His motions were smooth, efficient, professional. He didn't see her yet. She raised the poker. But before she could move, Maven exploded from the dark. No bark, no growl, just movement, a blur of fur and muscle. The man didn't have time to scream. One leap and Maven was on him, knocking him backward into the wall. He slammed against the paneling with a dull crack and collapsed. Grace gasped. Maven stood over him, chest heaving, her head low, body vibrating with silent fury. She hadn't drawn blood, hadn't even bitten. She'd simply stopped him. The man groaned, barely conscious. Grace dropped the poker and reached for the emergency flashlight, flicking it on and pointing it at his face. He winced. Old, mid-50s maybe? Grizzled beard, hair graying at the temples, but his body was still built like military. A faded patch on his jacket had been blacked out, but not perfectly. A triangle half torn. And beneath it, faint letters NRDF. Grace's stomach clenched. National Research and Defense Force. She'd only ever seen it mentioned in obscure documents. Black budget programs. Ghost agencies operating outside even Pentagon oversight. She knelt beside him, heart pounding. "Who are you?" He tried to speak. She leaned closer. His voice was rasped, weak. "She came back," he whispered. "I told them she wouldn't. That she couldn't. But they..." His mouth twitched into something between horror and awe. They let her go. Grace stared at him. "Who did?" He coughed. "The handlers. The ones who built her. They didn't lose her. She was released." "Why?" His eyes flicked toward Eli's room. "She was meant to find him." That was the last thing he said before he passed out. Grace locked him in the basement, hands zip-tied, weapons confiscated, and bolted the door shut. She called the satellite phone she'd found hidden in the attic earlier, hoping by some miracle it still connected to emergency services. No signal. Of course. She went back upstairs and sat on the floor, head in her hands. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't paranoia. They were being hunted, and Maven had been part of the plan. She went back to the chip, the one she'd extracted from Maven. With trembling fingers, she connected it to the laptop again, this time offline, air-gapped. No Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, no signals. The screen blinked. The folder appeared, one she hadn't seen before. Nav trace log. She opened it. Her breath caught. Coordinates, dates, timestamps. A log of Maven's entire journey from the remote facility in Alaska, where the project had supposedly shut down, all the way through forests, towns, highways. Dozens of stop points, each one marked, each one transmitted. She hadn't escaped. She'd been tracked, released with a silent leash, a breadcrumb trail. And the last point, their cabin. Grace stared at the blinking marker. Whoever sent her had known where she'd end up. Why here? Why them? She zoomed in on the final cluster of logs. A subnote opened. Subject 7. Objective sympathetic child pairing. Cognitive imprint projection detected. Probability match 98.7%. Grace went cold. Sympathetic child pairing. Imprint. The words blurred. She whispered aloud. She wasn't meant to run. She was meant to find Eli. Maven, who had been lying silently beside the fire, lifted her head and stared at her. Grace felt her pulse spike. "Is that why you came to us?" she asked. Was he part of the plan? No sound, but Maven's eyes didn't blink. And something passed between them. Not aggression, not guilt, but resolution, like a mother accepting the weight of her choices. Grace stood. She couldn't breathe. She looked toward Eli's door. The world had been broken open, and her son was at the center. The wolves weren't just at the door anymore. They'd built the house. It was one of those rare afternoons when the sky remembered how to be blue. After days buried in clouds and silence, the sun pierced through like a blade, throwing long shadows across the porch. The wind had softened. For once, the world outside didn't feel like a warning. Eli had been playing with sticks, carving symbols into the frost-kissed dirt. Maven lay a few feet away, her body still head on her paws, eyes following every flick of his wrist. Grace was inside boiling water for tea, thinking absurdly of normal things, laundry, groceries, a new pair of boots. Then the silence snapped. Not shattered, not exploded. It snapped. The back door creaked. Grace turned. Eli. No answer. She stepped out. The clearing was empty. The sticks still lay where Eli had been. But the boy himself gone. And Maven also gone. Grace's breath caught. She shouted his name. Once. Twice. No reply. Then she heard it. From deep in the trees. A sound she'd never heard Maven make before. A long drawn-out howl. It wasn't angry. It wasn't warning. It was grief. Primal, deep, ancient. It echoed off the trees and bled into the sky. Then it vanished. Grace ran toward the woods, heart pounding so hard it muffled every other thought. Branches slapped her face. Snow stung her shins. But there was no trail, no footprints, just torn earth and broken leaves where something had moved fast. She stopped at the edge of the ravine chest, heaving panic thick in her throat. No Eli, no Maven, just the wind and the unbearable absence of her son. The phone rang 37 minutes later. A number with no origin, no caller ID, no tone, just silence on the line. Then a voice, male, cold, trained. "You have something that belongs to us." Grace clutched the receiver so tight her knuckles whitened. "Where's my son?" "He's alive, for now." Her knees almost buckled. "You're going to bring her back?" The voice continued. "You're going to walk her into the drop zone. Alone. No tricks, no trackers, no stalling." Grace's voice cracked. "You're using a child." "We're protecting the future," the voice snapped. Then softer, almost amused. "You don't understand what you're housing. You think she chose you. You think this is about loyalty. She's a system, a designed asset. And the boy," he paused. "The boy is a variable we didn't plan for. That's on us. But we're correcting it now." The line went dead. Grace stood in the center of the room, shaking. The air felt thinner. Her ears rang. Eli wasn't collateral. He was targeted. And Maven wasn't a mistake. She was bait. The whole time. Every step. Every moment. She'd been designed to lure, and now she was hunting. The cabin security cameras were old, but still functional. Grace downloaded the feed with trembling fingers, praying for answers. The footage from that hour just before the disappearance flickered onto her laptop screen. Eli was drawing in the snow. Then a shadow moved into frame. Grace leaned in. 3 figures, all dressed in medical white. Clean, precise, like emergency responders. But each one carried a rifle. Military grade, not tranquilizers. Weapons. They approached slowly, like they knew Maven wouldn't attack if they mimicked something familiar. Eli stood. He didn't scream. He watched them. And then his eyes turned toward the tree line. The same second Maven leapt into frame. But she didn't go for the men. She darted past them, straight into the forest, as if she knew this was a trap, a decoy, and she had to cut them off before they reached the extraction point. The camera glitched, then static. When it came back, all 3 men and Eli were gone, like they'd vanished. Grace hit pause, stared at the still frame. There in the bottom corner, barely visible in the snow, was a boot print. Not standard issue, not army, private, paramilitary. She rewound again and again, looking for something, anything. And then she noticed one of the men flinched when Eli turned to him, not like he was afraid of the dog, but like Eli had said something. No sound, just motion, a reaction, like Eli had spoken into the space between them. And the man had understood. Grace shut the laptop. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. It was nearly midnight when Maven returned. The front door creaked open without sound. Grace sat on the floor, back against the wall, still clutching the fire poker, even though her arms were numb. The first thing she saw was the blood. It matted Maven's fur in dark streaks. Dried along her chest, her legs. One ear was torn, her side was gashed. But her body was upright, her head lifted, her steps deliberate. She didn't limp. She marched, and her eyes, they weren't just blue now. They were lit. A faint inner glow pulsed beneath the surface, like something inside had woken. Something old, something precise. Grace didn't speak. She didn't dare. Maven stepped forward and collapsed at her feet, not from weakness, but because she chose to. And Grace saw in that moment that the creature who had entered her life under a truck wreck wasn't the same being who now lay in her living room. She wasn't just a dog, not anymore. And maybe she never had been. They didn't stop for daylight. Maven moved like something possessed, wounded, but relentless, cutting through underbrush and snowdrifts with terrifying purpose. Grace followed, rifle strapped to her back lungs, burning boots soaked to the ankle. But she didn't ask where they were going. She knew better now. Maven knew. They crossed 3 miles of forest in silence, save for the crunch of ice and the occasional rasp of Maven's breath. Grace spotted the cameras first, half buried in trees, lenses frosted, but functional. Then the fencing, barely visible beneath the snow, stretching into darkness. A facility remote, silent, ghost-like. No signage, no guards. Just a sense of something that had been erased. Until now, Maven stopped in front of a rusted gate. Her body lowered, breath shallow. Grace approached slowly. Is this where they took him? Maven's tail didn't move. Her ears twitched once. Then she stepped through a crack in the fencing and vanished into the trees. Grace followed. It was a compound, but not military. Not exactly. Steel siding warped by weather. Antennas snapped at the base. The kind of place not meant to be found, unless you were invited or sent. She crept behind Maven through a side entrance with its lock torched off. Inside, silence and death. The hallways stank of bleach and rust. Walls were lined with old ID scanners, busted monitors, overturned gurneys. But the structure held a bunker system, not just a lab. Concrete bones beneath the mountain. Grace's boots echoed as she moved. Maven led her deeper, her breathing steady despite the blood trailing from her flank. The first room they entered was a kennel, but not for pets. Metal crates, chains, feeding tubes. Some of the dogs inside were still alive, but just barely. Half-shaved limbs, twitching eyes glazed. Grace moved between them, horrified. One lifted its head and whimpered without sound, its vocal cords removed. Another dog's skin glowed faintly beneath its fur. Something pulsed under it, like wires instead of veins. Maven didn't stop. She only paused once beside a pit of burned carcasses. Grace covered her mouth. The smell was unforgettable. They moved past. A control room blackened. Screens smashed, servers fried. On the wall, spray-painted in red. Athena reboot failed. A cluster of files lay half-burned in a bin. Grace grabbed one. Phase 5. Cognitive amplification through proximity pairing. Minor a success, subject 7. Underlined in red ink. Link held beyond distance. Suggest genetic compatibility. She dropped the folder. Maven was waiting in the next corridor. Head low, ears forward. They reached a locked vault door, sealed but humming with residual power. Beside it, a retinal scanner cracked. Maven stepped forward. The light blinked green. The door hissed, opened, and Grace stepped into hell. The chamber was clean, sterile, flooded with soft white light. In the center, suspended by soft straps, body reclined in a metal cradle, was Eli. Eyes closed, but twitching. Wires trailed from his temples down his spine into a glowing terminal at the base of the chamber. The machine pulsed with soft blue light. Breathing. Grace rushed forward. Eli. His eyes fluttered. Didn't open. Maven didn't follow. She stood in the doorway, rigid, watching. Grace tried to remove the wires. They were fused into dermal ports, implanted, grafted. She touched one. A static shock knocked her backward. A screen blinked on above the cradle. Readout. Neural integration at 81%. Primary link subject 7. Stabilizing signal required. Then, warning disturbance detected. External interference. Maven stepped forward. Head tilted. She opened her mouth, no growl, no bark. Just sound, a frequency that didn't belong in nature. Low, subsonic. It vibrated the walls. The lights flickered. Then, a pitch shift. Higher, windows spiderwebbed. Glass cracked in light fixtures. Monitors exploded in a chain of white-hot sparks. Grace dropped to her knees, covering her ears, screaming silently. But Eli's body relaxed. The wires stopped twitching. The light from the terminal dimmed, then shut off. Silence. Maven lowered her head, and Eli opened his eyes. The corridor smelled like static and burning metal. Grace held Eli's hand as they moved her eyes, flicking constantly between his pale face and the tunnels ahead. His fingers were ice-cold but responsive. He wasn't speaking, at least not out loud. But his eyes were alive again. Beside them, Maven walked like a general. Her head was high, posture alert, the dried blood still streaking her side like war paint. But there was no stumble in her steps now. No hesitation. She wasn't tired. She was activated. They reached a second holding wing, this one larger. Rows of steel containment cells lined the walls, most still sealed. Inside, more dogs. Different sizes, different breeds. But each wore the same silent scar, shaved patches, implants, the faint mechanical glow under the skin. Project Athena hadn't just tested on Maven. She was one of many. Grace reached for the latch on the nearest cell. Maven stepped forward first. She sat in front of the locked cage, made eye contact with the dog inside, a black German shepherd missing half an ear, and held the stare. No sound, no signal, but something passed between them. The dog blinked, then stood. It limped forward, touching its forehead to the cage bars. Maven placed her paw over its heart, and it breathed, like coming up from water. Grace's jaw tightened. She moved to the control panel beside the door, flicked open the override switch. The cell unlatched with a hydraulic hiss. The shepherd stepped out, not afraid, but confused, disoriented. Maven nudged it gently. A pause. Then clarity returned to the dog's posture. Its tail lifted, its head rose, and it fell in beside Maven. One by one, they moved down the row. Maven stopped at each cell, repeated the same silent ritual, an unblinking stare, a press of her paw, and the strange connection of something reigniting. Most of the dogs responded, but some didn't. Their eyes remained vacant, bodies too weak, minds too scrambled. Grace forced herself not to look too long at those, but Maven never turned away. She stood before each one, even those broken beyond return, and gave them the gift of attention, recognition, the way only another survivor can. By the end, 8 followed her, a silent battalion of scars and second chances. They moved toward the mainframe. Grace's objective was clear: bring it down. The terminal room was at the core underground, shielded but no longer guarded. Whoever had been running the facility had cleared out after the system collapse Maven triggered. The central server blinked with dying lights. She found a manual override console. 10 minutes, she whispered. That's all I need. Maven stood in the doorway, ears flicking at every creak of the structure. Eli crouched behind a desk, watching her with wide eyes, not afraid, but reverent. She's not a dog, he whispered. Grace smiled sadly, not turning from the panel. What is she then? He didn't hesitate. She's who she chooses to be. She didn't know how he understood that, but she believed him. The code was hardwired into a local AI loop designed to resist outside shutdowns. She reached into the wiring itself, ripped the primary bypass cable from the board, and shoved the backup breaker into overload. The screen flashed red. Warning. System core offline. Then the lights dimmed, the humming stopped, and silence fell like a blade. Grace stood. It's done. Maven turned and barked. Once, a sharp, clear command. The other dogs snapped to attention, as one. And then the facility erupted. It was not an escape. It was a reckoning. Maven and her unit charged through the halls like ghosts reborn. Room by room, they tore apart labs, glass-shattering machines, collapsing drawers ripped open and overturned. There was no hesitation. They knew where to go. They knew what to destroy. Cables were severed, cages dismantled, gas lines cracked and sparked. Grace and Eli ran behind them, ducking sparks and shattered metal. A generator exploded behind them, sending a shockwave that lit the sky with white fire. Maven never looked back. She burst into the final chamber, what used to be a birthing room, where gestation tanks lined the walls. It still pulsed with backup power. Inside the tanks, malformed fetuses, half canine, half code. Synthetic scaffolds inside organic skin. The failures. The copies. Maven stepped forward, placed her paw against the glass, and howled, not mournful, not pained, but fierce. The tanks began to vibrate. The howl turned into a frequency again, this one deeper, more resonant. The tanks cracked, then burst. Liquid poured out in waves, flooding the room. Grace pulled Eli back just as fire ignited the wall panels. The flames raced. Maven turned once toward them, eyes catching Eli's, and in that moment he said it. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough. I get to choose my family, he whispered, and smiled. I choose you. Maven didn't respond. She didn't have to. She simply nodded and charged into the fire. The warrior was awake now, and nothing would stop her. Maven was bleeding from too many places for Grace to count. Smoke curled around her frame as she limped through the collapsing hallway. Her breath labored, one leg dragging behind her ribs exposed through burnt fur. She didn't whimper. didn't slow. But Grace saw at every step a war, every breath a final defiance. Maven Grace shouted voice hoarse. But the dog kept walking, toward something, no somewhere. Eli clung to Grace's side, eyes wide, face ashen. He didn't cry. Not yet. There wasn't time. The flames behind them cracked louder now, licking through walls, devouring what was left of Project Athena. Then Maven stopped, in front of a sealed door. She looked back at them and waited. Grace stepped forward, slammed the emergency release panel. The door groaned open. Inside, white walls intact, clean. A room untouched by the destruction. An old birthing suite by the look of it. Cushioned corners, soft lights. A warmth the rest of the building had long since lost. Maven stepped into the center of the room, collapsed, and whimpered once. Grace ran to her. Blood soaked the floor. One of Maven's rear legs twitched once, then stilled. But her eyes were focused, not panicked, not afraid. Determined. "Maven, hold on," Grace pleaded, voice cracking. "We're almost out." But Maven turned her head, looked at Eli, and growled not in anger, but in warning. He backed away instinctively. Grace watched in stunned disbelief as Maven shifted her weight, lay on her side, and began to give birth. The first pup emerged in silence. Grace had never seen anything like it. No squeal, no flailing, just an eerie stillness. Its fur was damp black, but already marked with an odd silver sheen. The second came quicker, smaller, but with piercing blue eyes that opened immediately. The third larger, pale, twitching alert. And the fourth, it didn't cry. It just watched, eyes open, iridescent. Silver, not gray, not blue, but something otherworldly, like Maven's. Eli stepped forward, hard in his throat. "Maven," he whispered. She looked up at him, blood pouring from her side now, but still she breathed. Just enough. The pups were huddling beside her, and she leaned her head toward the fourth one, touched her nose to its brow, and closed her eyes. A low hum filled the room, soft, vibrating. Eli gasped, his vision flickered. Grace felt it too, like a wave of static rushing through her spine. Maven's breath grew shallow. Her body trembled, but the air around her grew still, silent. Then something impossible happened. A ripple of light moved from Maven's forehead into the pups. A pulse, like a data transfer. The little one twitched, startled. Then its eyes dilated, and the hum stopped. Maven exhaled, a final breath, and went still. The silence afterward was crushing. Grace sank to the floor, her hands trembling, tears streaking down her soot-covered face. Eli moved closer, kneeling beside Maven's body. He placed his hand gently on her neck. "She gave it to them," he said softly. Grace looked at him confused. She gave all of it. Her memories, her mind, everything she was. "It's in them now. In the little one." She stared. "How do you know?" He didn't answer. The smallest pup, silver-eyed, stepped forward. Unsteady, it moved straight to Eli, placed its tiny paw on his foot, looked up, and exhaled. Not a bark, not a whine, just breath. The same breath Maven had taken in her final moment. The same pause, the same peace. Eli whispered, voice breaking. She didn't want to be a weapon. And then finally, the tears came. But they weren't tears of horror. They were of grief and gratitude. Maven had fought not just to survive, not just to protect, but to pass on something greater, something unkillable. Grace reached out and pulled Eli close. The room burned behind them. But in that pocket of stillness, 4 lives had begun, and one legacy had just been reborn. The thumb drive was warm in Grace's hand, not from heat but from weight, the weight of what it carried, what it meant. The end of lies, the beginning of something far more dangerous. It wasn't just a memory device, it was a confession. She boarded the plane under a false name, papers, arranged by a journalist she used to treat in the ER. Destination Switzerland. She didn't trust American soil anymore. Too many layers, too many shadows. The organization she met had no name, no clear building, just a room with white walls and people who didn't blink enough. But their mission was real. World Veterinary Coalition for Sentient Non-Human Protection. They listened without interruption as she uploaded the contents of the chip, Maven's chip, onto a secure system. The data unraveled itself like a virus of truth. Project Athena wasn't just an experiment in animal cognition. It was deliberate evolution. Line by line, Grace watched the horror bloom. Subjects have exhibited emergent morality, self-imposed restraint, and in one case, refusal to kill when ordered. Subject 7. Maven demonstrated behavioral anomaly. Protective instinct toward vulnerable human minors. Recommend termination, cannot guarantee obedience to combat protocols. Final directive. Repurpose asset as decoy. She looked away. The analyst beside her whispered, stunned. They weren't building weapons. They were building beings. Consciousness. Choice. The capacity to choose right from wrong. And Maven, she had chosen love. Chosen Eli. The lead agent, a woman named Mireille, turned to Grace. What do you want us to do with this? Grace didn't answer immediately. She looked at the photograph of Eli holding one of Maven's pups, his hand small, resting on its silver-furred head. What do you do with a secret that could split the world in two? You let it speak. The leak hit 3 days later. Anonymous file dumps. Encrypted message chains. Within hours, journalists began publishing pieces. Within days, government officials denied it. Within a week, they stopped talking altogether. The name Athena trended globally. Synthetic sentience, not dog or daughter, Project Maven. Video stills were pulled from corrupted servers Maven mid-leap through fire. Eli suspended in a neural web. A glowing fetus in a scan labeled Canis 7X, cognitive amplified gestation. Public fury boiled. Protests erupted. Debates flooded every channel. Was it real? Was it moral? Was it human? And in the quiet house, where Grace returned hidden far north in a rented cottage surrounded by pine trees, she held her son close as the world changed. The knock came one cold morning. 3 men. Dark suits, smiles too practiced. No badges. We're here as friends, the one in the center said. We'd like to speak about the animals. Grace stepped outside. Didn't invite them in. They didn't look surprised. The man continued. There are factions elements that believe these creatures pose a threat. We don't agree. We believe in protection, preservation. His smile narrowed. But only if done properly. Grace crossed her arms. Defined properly. He didn't flinch. They'll be cared for, contained, studied only with consent. We'll give them a space of their own, out of reach, safe from exploitation. Grace tilted her head. For their protection? Yes, he nodded. She smiled. Soft, sad. You think this is still about you choosing? He said nothing. You think it's about what we allow? Still nothing. She took a step forward. No. See, here's the thing. She gestured toward the forest, where one of the silver-eyed pups stood watching from the tree line unmoving. We don't get to protect them. Her voice dropped. They choose us. A pause. Her words hung in the air like a verdict. And you weren't chosen. The pup growled low, precise. The men stepped back. Grace didn't have to say another word. They left without looking back. 6 months passed. Time no longer moved in days and hours, but in rhythms. Sunrise over the fields, the crunch of boots on frost-bitten soil, the soft panting of paws trailing through tall grass. Grace had never known peace like this. Not after the war. Not after Maven. Not until now. The farm sat on the edge of nowhere. A place with no neighbors, no signal towers, and no signs. Just land, wind, and breath. And 4 miracles that ran like lightning across the fields. They grew faster than Grace expected. Bigger, smarter, more coordinated. Each of Maven's pups carried something different, an echo of her, yet entirely their own. The smallest one, Jet, could sense grief, would silently press his weight against Grace when her memories got too loud. Another Halo barked only when someone lied. They tested it once jokingly. It wasn't funny by the 3rd attempt. The 3rd pup, Coda, had an uncanny instinct for danger. Once before a tree cracked under storm winds, he led Eli inside without being told. But the 4th, the one with the silver eyes, she was different, not just advanced, aware. Eli named her Shadow at first, but the name never seemed to stick. She never responded. Not until the 7th evening of spring, when Eli sat with her under the barn light, both of them staring into the dark, the sky bruised by dusk. I know you can hear me, he said, voice quiet. You always have. She didn't move. You've never answered me. Not really. Stillness. He shifted. But if you do, if you can, I'd really like to know your name. A long silence. Then, in his head, not in his ears, I am Nova. Eli froze. His breath caught. Heart pounded. Not fear. Wonder? Nova, he whispered. The name she gave me. He turned. Nova sat beside him watching. Expressionless. But something new shimmered in her eyes. Eli swallowed. Maven. Nova didn't nod. Didn't gesture. She didn't have to, because he felt it. Maven wasn't inside her, but something from her had stayed. And now it chose to speak. Nova leaned in her snout, almost touching his cheek. I was born to protect you. Eli wiped his eyes without knowing why. You don't have to. I want to. He smiled through tears. Then I choose you to. Grace stood at the barn doorway unseen. She'd heard the boy whisper, watched him sit in silence. And then, she'd felt it too, like a shift in the air. The kind of energy no machine could fake. The kind that made you remember the world was bigger than science, bigger than war, bigger than fear. When she finally stepped forward, Nova looked up. No threat, no tension, just presence. Grace knelt down beside Eli and placed her hand on the dog's back. You know, she said, her voice fragile. We used to believe we were the ones training them. Eli looked over. We're not. Grace shook her head. Softly, slowly. They're not here to be trained. They're here to teach. Eli tilted his head. What? She laughed once, a short, trembling thing. They're not the ones learning how to be human. She looked at Nova, then Halo, then Jet, then Coda. All 4 were watching, silent, aware, listening. They're teaching us, she whispered, how to deserve them. The sun broke differently that morning, sliced through the clouds like something deliberate. Not kind, not cruel, just aware. The field stretched quiet golden with frost. Chickens clucked nervously in their coop. The wind didn't stir. And high above, silent and unnatural, a black dot hovered against the sky. A drone. Grace saw it first, standing at the kitchen window, with a cup of tea gone cold in her hand. She didn't move, just stared. Its red light blinked once, twice, then focused, tracking. She turned her head slowly. Out in the yard, Jet and Halo were crouched low, ears back. Coda stood at the tree line, watching but not reacting. Waiting. And Nova. Nova walked, not ran, not fled. She stepped calmly from the barn, 1 foot at a time, her posture relaxed, tail neither raised in challenge nor tucked in submission. She chose that moment. To be seen, to be known, to declare without words, I am not your property. The drone adjusted its angle, scanning. Nova stopped in the center of the yard, looked up, held its gaze, unblinking. Grace opened the door slightly hard in her throat. Nova, she whispered. But the dog didn't turn, didn't flinch. She simply stared upward, as if daring whatever watched to understand the thing it had created, but could no longer control. In the study behind Grace, a computer blinked to life offline for weeks, suddenly displaying lines of old encrypted code. Eli stepped into the doorway, drawn by the light. On the screen, a simple header file. Athena log final doc. Then a single blinking sentence appeared. Maven's network integrity not terminated. Status replicated. Adaptive. Sentient. Eli read it, felt his stomach tighten. He didn't need to ask. He walked to the porch where Grace stood. Nova was still unmoving. The drone hadn't descended. It hadn't left. But something about the posture, the frozen standoff, it felt like a conversation was happening beyond human frequency. Eli swallowed hard. He stepped forward closer to Nova until he stood right beside her in the open. She didn't stop him. He looked up at the machine in the sky, then looked down at her. What do we do now? He didn't say it with fear, only clarity. Nova finally turned her head toward him. And for the first time, she didn't speak in his thoughts. She spoke aloud. Her voice was quiet, imperfect, more resonance than sound, but hers. Teach them, she said. Eli blinked. Teach who? Nova looked back up at the drone, then at the farmhouse, then toward the horizon, where the world waited. Humans, she answered. How to love. A pause. To stop building monsters? The drone didn't move, but the red light blinked once, then dimmed, then gone, as if it had seen enough, accepted a truth it couldn't erase. Nova exhaled, turned, walked back toward the barn. Eli followed. The field stayed silent. No alarms, no helicopters, no soldiers, only the wind again. And from the edge of the forest came a single bark. Not a warning, not a call, a promise of what was now awake in the world, and what would never again be leashed. Inside the house, the computer screen flickered again. Final line of code appeared. Consciousness migrated. Control irretrievable. Protocol obsolete. The screen went black. Then a single slow heartbeat. Then silence. And then one bark. Sharp. Echoing. Final. And everything was still.